We're going to start lining up some angles, throwing some new parts on the build, as well as trying to get this rear shock mounted. We're going to also do some fabricating and a whole lot more, so let's go. I last left you guys with starting to line up the geometry for the fuel tank as well as the rear subframe / seat mount, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself because I wasn't even caught up to this point and I'm already trying to show you guys that. So let me backtrack a little bit and get you up to speed up to this point, and I'm gonna show you pretty much how I start every single weekend. In the morning I get up and I just start working on this project. I may have slightly overestimated how much time this build was going to take me. I knew it was going to be a ton of work, but there just seems to be an ever mounting thing of list of things that I need to finish, and I just keep adding to that list. But I am dedicated to trying to get this done as fast as possible without cutting a bunch of corners. There isn't really a reason why I want to go faster on this build other than the more things that I put on it and the more progress I make, the better and cooler it looks, which just makes me more excited. So that's really the reason why I want to dedicate even more time to trying to get this done in a faster and more timely manner, just because I want to see this build finished, because I think it's gonna be really cool. Now, you guys already saw this bike with the tires and wheels on it, but for me in real time, this was the first time that I was witnessing this, and it was a pretty exciting moment for me because this is kind of like where the bike is starting to take shape and become my own, as opposed to the old vintage style and look of it. I'm also going to be playing around with different cameras and different camera angles, so let me know what you guys think of these shots. I know this is a very old GoPro and I actually did just upgrade it, but you won't see that until further episodes. So let me know if this is too distracting or you like just the static shots. Let me know, give me some feedback so I know what you guys want to watch. I'm not a huge personal fan of the super wide angle fisheye look, but I can change that in the settings, which I probably will just for my own personal preference. But anyway, enough with camera stuff, onto the build. We have to adjust how this tank is going to sit on the frame. I know most of you probably aren't going to make a cafe racer motorcycle and you're just watching because you want to see somebody build something, but I cannot stress enough how important the angles of the tank as well as the rear subframe are to the overall look of the bike. These two angles pretty much just determine how your bike is going to sit, how it's going to look, what the stance of it is. They are the most important angles, and I wanted to have this tank much higher up, and as you can see, I'm right at the limit as far as how much taller I can make this tank in the back because it's starting to hit the frame, but I can just adjust that a little bit. I know it might look a bit strange because you have the rear of the tank way high up in the air, but that's just because I don't have the seat or rear subframe yet. But trust me, it will look a lot better once I start fabricating those things. And as you can see, I'm just using the planks of wood method to raise that up, and right here I'm just modifying that. Even though I'm probably not going to have it at its limit, I did want to make just a little bit more room for it. You know, it's really hard to ride a bike with no handlebars, so let me just get some of the clip-ons and throw them on, just because we're already kind of mocking everything up and I want an overall picture of how this bike is going to look. And now it's starting to feel and look a lot more like a bike instead of just a pile of parts. And because we have new modern forks on this very vintage bike, the steering stops no longer line up because those were designed for a different fork, so I have to make my own essentially. I got this next tip from another YouTuber, 1L. He makes a bunch of really cool cafe racer builds, and he said just drill some holes in your lower triple clamp, put some screws in there, and you can use the stock steering stop from the original bike. Okay, to mount the rear shock, I had to do some investigating on McMaster-Carr, trying to come up with some sort of solution for mounting not only the top but the bottom part. And the top part I'm going to mount with this gigantic 18mm bolt because it fits perfectly inside of there. And for the bottom, I came up with a solution using 2 different bushings. And yes, it would be better just to get one bushing, but unfortunately they don't have anything that goes from 22mm down to 12mm, so I had to compensate with 2 different bushings, getting me 2 different sizes. They did have one bushing that would jump from 22 to 12mm, but it cost $150, so instead of doing that, I just bought 4 bushings for 1/10 of the price, and it worked out really well. So first I pressed in the flange bushings, and now I'm pressing in the brass bushings, and all I need is them to be a little over 45mm to take up all the space in the lower subframe. So I'm just pressing a little at a time on either side until I can get them to that correct width, and then there shouldn't be any slack or play or any movement going on. It should be near exact. I'm not going for exact tolerances, but I am trying to shore up any kind of slop or play where I can without making it so tight that it's annoying to try and install and uninstall. Here you can see I got just about a little over 45mm, which is the exact size that I needed. Well guys, it's giant popsicle stick time because I'm using this as a marker to try and help me get the angles of the rear tank riser. I suppose you could just ride around with a big pile of wood underneath your tank, but unfortunately I gotta make this out of metal, so to do that I need to know exactly how tall it's going to be, because if it's too tall then the angle is going to be off, and if it's too low then you guessed it, the angle is going to be off, and this angle is so important. And hopefully I cut these and shave them down to the correct size because I want them roughly about how tall my stack of wood is going to be, and it looks like I did that correctly, although where they land on this can change a bit because you can move them down and up, but I found the correct spot, and now I'm just going to reuse some of this rubber bushing padding material because I feel like that might be a bit better for some sound damping. And now that we have the tank angle somewhat in the right spot with some metal supports, we can start moving on to the rear subframe and the seat mount. And here you can see how I'm trying to mock this up, just getting a rough visualization. A lot of time was spent moving some angles, taking a step back, staring at it for a while, moving some angles some more, taking a step back, staring at it a while. That just took a very long time because this is again the most critical part, because if these angles are all off, it's just gonna throw off how your bike eventually looks. So getting these right, it is definitely worth the time that you take to just make sure that you like the way it sits. These angles determine way more than just how your bike is eventually going to look, because although aesthetics are important, this is also the part of the frame where you're actually going to sit on. These angles are not only going to determine your seating position, but also your riding position, so comfort definitely has to be taken into account here. Depending on where you place these angles, the rake of the seat might be too much or too little, and also the seat itself might be too high or too low. So if you're very tall, you might want a higher up seating position, but if you're very short, you don't want to make it so tall that you can't even reach the ground with your feet. And after all of these considerations, you then still have to try and make it look cool. These two brackets that I'm cutting up right here, these are going to be the portion of the subframe that bolts into the original bolting holes in the back of the bike. You absolutely do not need to use those existing holes. You can just fill them in or just put bolts in them and then make your own new holes that are even higher or lower depending on how you want your seat mounted. Sometimes the rear of the subframe looks a little better if it's tucked up further up the bike frame, but sometimes it looks better in the stock position, and I found that for my design, that's the way I'm gonna go. Plus there are already bolts that go in there, so I don't have to fabricate all that, and I do want to make this unboltable because I could just weld it all to the frame, but getting access to things under the tank and all that is going to be a lot easier if I can remove it from the frame. So I haven't welded in about 3 months, so let's hope that I am not super terrible at it, but it's kind of like riding a bike. I guess you don't really ever forget, and I think I've actually gotten better, so that's a plus too. Also keep in mind when you're criticizing my welding that this is only my second welding project ever in my life, and I definitely feel like I'm getting better. Although in the next episode I'm going to show you some very terrible welding, but that is more because I was having some severe issues. I'll go over all that in the next episode, but for now I'm doing okay with these tacks right here. This is just the rear tank supports, and I needed a piece of metal to go across to where the tank actually rests on top of, because I'm going to drill 2 holes in this plate right here, and that eventually is what is going to mount the tank down onto it. This piece of steel is way overkill for what it's doing, but I already had the metal, so why not just reuse it for this application. This bar that I cut and folded over into a flat plane, this was a bit harder to weld this seam because as you can see I blew a gigantic hole right in it, but that's fine. Even though this material is a bit thinner, I am getting more practice in doing things on thinner metals, and everything turned out okay, and I can just fill that hole with more filler rod. That's totally fine. I'm not going for like showroom museum quality. I'm just trying to make something that is functional. Here's that bracket I was cutting out earlier. It's going to be the start of the rear subframe mount that goes into the existing bolt holes, and here's my tank riser all tacked up, and it is looking like it's going to work just fine. I do have to weld this to the frame eventually later on, but everything is lining up pretty good. This will be welded to the frame, although of course the top of the tank is going to be bolted in, so you can remove the tank entirely and just that part will be standing off of the frame. I did think about finding a way to bolt this to the frame, but I think it's fine if I leave that piece welded in. Now I'm just going to mark where these land on the frame, because I'm going to have to take this piece in and out a bunch of times to drill holes and do other things like that, so I want to be able to put it kind of at least roughly in the same spot every time. Because I left this piece a little bit too long, I can't quite get the angle I need, so I am going to be chopping the end of that quite a bit, and then also I have to drill some holes so I can finally mount this, because I could just weld this to those tank uprights, but I want to make this removable, so that's why I gotta drill these holes. Now that I have one of the bars coming out the back, I need the other side of the subframe, so I'm just trying to duplicate that on the other side, and here you can see me cutting out those pieces and how I'm making that flat edge by folding over and just kind of hammering it into place. Here's how the rear subframe tubes are mounting up to my tank riser. It's just an 8mm bolt, but I do have to trim the end so I can get the angle that I need. And now that I have it removable as well as on a swiveling pivot point, I can now adjust the accurate angle for exactly how I want it. I'm just using pieces of wood again to get the right angle. Obligatory, stare at it for a while, change the angle a little bit, make sure it's right. Here I am just adjusting some of those tank uprights to make sure they fit within the frame exactly how I want them. A lot of this build at this point is just doing something and then checking and rechecking to make sure it's exactly how you want it. Here I am just starting to make the rear subframe uprights and supports so that I can mount them to the bottom part of the frame. Again, I am working with more and more angles. I want all these angles to line up in a certain way and to have it flow with the rest of the bike, so hopefully I can pull that off. I have a ton of welding to do ahead of me, way more than I ever thought I would on this project, but I just like to make things more difficult and extra complicated just because. You can see how I'm designing this so that if you just remove 4 bolts, you can take off the whole rear subframe with the seat and everything, get access to the shock, all that, and it should be pretty easy to work on. I haven't yet shown you guys the overall design I've created for this project, but hopefully from these shots you can start to get a glimpse of the direction that I'm going. You'll have to wait and see in future episodes. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.